Postmillennials say the world keeps getting better, but I just got kicked out of my own Minecraft church. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. You may be wondering, where are these churches? Well, I used to have one. I used to have a big, beautiful church named St. Athanasius Presbyterian Church. It was in the Presbyterian town of Borealis that was full of beautiful churches and houses and stuff. But my church, along with the whole town, got hijacked by the villagers who worship the pink sheep, and I was forced to flee far away into this distant jungle, far away from any civilized part of this Minecraft server. So I am forced to start from scratch with nothing but the Presbyterian confessions of faith that I snatched from the church before I left. So right now I am starting from scratch using silly wooden tools and stuff, even though I used to have diamond tools and diamond armor back in my old church, but all the resources got hijacked along with the church. So I lost basically everything except the beliefs themselves. And often in Minecraft, we like to think that it's going to be a constant uphill for us. We like to think that we're going to keep being able to build on our past achievements and keep being able to get newer, better stuff, but sometimes we lose a lot all at once, either by a creeper blowing up our chests, or with villagers who worship the pink sheep hijacking our churches and stuff. But no, either way, often it's not a constant high, it's not a constant uphill, and there are a lot of setbacks. There are some Christians who think that this is going to be the way it is for Christianity, that the church is going to keep getting more successes, and that the world is going to keep getting more Christianized, and will be fully Christianized before Jesus comes back. These people are called Postmillennials, and in this video I'm going to explain why I'm not postmillennial. So, postmillennialism is one of the positions on Christian eschatology. Eschatology is just a really fancy, nerdy theology word. It's not that nerdy. It's a really fancy word for what we think about the future. So when someone uses the word eschatologically, what they mean is in view of the future. So postmillennialism is one of the eschatological positions in the Christian church. So postmillennialism basically has to do with this thing called the millennium, which is mentioned in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation describes this 1,000-year reign of Christ, and there's a lot of debate as to when that's going to happen in relation to the second coming of Christ. So post-millennials think that Jesus is going to come back after this millennium, or post-millennium. So if you think Jesus is coming back after the millennium, that means there's a 1,000-year reign of Christ before he actually comes back. So if it's before he actually comes back, it must really refer to a reign of Christianity. So that's why postmillennials are very optimistic about the future, because they think Christianity is going to rule the world someday. The world's going to be fully Christianized before the return of Christ. A different eschatological position is premillennialism, which says that Jesus is coming back before the millennium, before the 1,000-year reign. So that means he's not really ruling over the world until he comes back. So that's why premillennials are more pessimistic about the future, because they think the kingdom of God isn't really going to be here until Jesus comes back. And there's a third position, which is what I hold to, called amillennialism. Means, not, where we think the millennium is really just a metaphor for the spiritual reign of Jesus from heaven, which is the time between his first and second comings. The millennium is really just the church age. And, like postmillennials, we believe that the millennium will have a transformative impact on the physical world. That's why the church has had such a transformative impact on the world. The church built hospitals, the church started the modern university system, the church did more for human rights and helping the poor than like any other institution. So the spiritual reign of Christ has a profound impact on this world, but as amillennials, we don't believe that there's any promise of the church taking over the world, nor is there any promise of a good future for the church in a material sense before Jesus comes back. So postmillennials think things are going to generally keep getting better for the church. Premillennials think things are going to keep getting worse for the church until Jesus comes back. But amillennials, the amillennial position tends to be a neutral position. Things are going to be going through cycles. There are some optimistic amillennials, there's some pessimistic amillennials, but generally amillennials believe the church is going to go through cycles of glory and cycles of persecution and darkness. I personally think there's been about 3 cycles of glory in the church and, 4 ages of darkness. I think we are transitioning right now from the third age of glory in the church, the third golden age of the church, to a new age of darkness, and it's going to be unless something changes really fast, it's going to be a long time before the church ever reaches some 4th age of glory. So, I think once the church started, it was already in an age of persecution. It was immediately persecuted once it started. First, it was persecuted by the Jewish authorities, and then by the Roman authorities. And the church had on and off persecution until Constantine legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire in the 4th century. And then soon after that, Christianity was made the state religion in the Roman Empire. And then right after that, I think there was legitimately a golden age of Christianity from around, 300 to 600 before the rise of Islam. During that time, that's when most of the ecumenical councils happened, and the early ecumenical councils were really important for the theological development of the church, for clarifying what true Christian teaching is as opposed to false Christian teaching. The ecumenical councils were really important. The first council clarified Jesus is God. The second clarified Jesus is truly human and that the Holy Spirit is God. The third council clarified that Jesus is one person. We can't separate his humanity and divinity, so that means we need to call Mary the Mother of God. But the fourth council clarified Jesus still has 2 natures. The 5th and 6th councils were kind of important. They had, you can see the seeds of corruption in the church beginning to seep in the 5th and 6th councils, and especially in the 7th council, which is the council that demands that you venerate icons. It doesn't just say that Christians can venerate icons, but it says Christians must venerate icons or burn in hell. That's what it says. It's the Second Council of Nicaea, not to be confused with the First Council of Nicaea. The Second Council of Nicaea has mandatory icon veneration, and that coincides with, I think, the end of that first Christian Golden Age. I think most of Eastern Orthodoxy is rooted in the theological developments of that first Golden Age because Eastern Orthodoxy has a unique focus on the ecumenical councils. And I think Catholicism is largely rooted in the second Golden Age. So there was like a dark age right after that first Golden Age. In like the early Middle Ages, there was the rise of Islam. There were a lot of political tensions that led to the Great Schism. And during the 800s and 900s, there aren't really a lot of theological writings from the church. There were some good things like St. Boniface converting the pagans or whatever. But generally, it was a pretty dark age for the church. The church was called the pornocracy during that period because so many, bishops hired prostitutes and all that. But I think after the Great Schism, the Catholic Church had a golden age with medieval scholasticism. We often think of the Middle Ages as all dark and bad, but a lot of the most important developments for the modern world happened during the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were when the church first developed the modern university and hospital system, and St. Anselm, right after the Great Schism, started medieval scholasticism, and that was the sort of groundwork for later thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus to figure out so many detailed theological things. So most of Roman Catholic theological development, I mean, there's been things since then. There's been like the Counter-Reformation and the Second Vatican Council. But I think the bulk of Roman Catholic theological development with like Thomas Aquinas and stuff was during that second Golden Age, that period of medieval scholasticism, and so much important stuff happened there. Remember, I'm a classical Protestant. I'm not some sort of Anabaptist. I'm not Baptist. So the Reformation, the Reformed churches, like Presbyterian churches, we see ourselves as descendants of the medieval Catholic Church, but reformed by the Bible. So we can really appreciate the history of medieval scholasticism, even if there were some developments that we wouldn't necessarily agree with, like Thomas Aquinas' doctrine of transubstantiation, for example. And then after that, yes, it was a high point for the church in many ways, the Middle Ages, but a lot of the worst corruption in the church also began to start around that time. You had St. Francis of Assisi having a vision of how corrupt the church was, and eventually, like in the 1400s and early 1500s, that was when the Catholic Church was at its most corrupt point. It was way more corrupt back then than today. That's when all the indulgences and all that stuff happened. So that's when Martin Luther had to step in and change things. And then, so that was like another dark age of the church, but that gave way to the Protestant Reformation, which I think led to the Third Golden Age, and most of Protestant theology, I think, comes from this Third Golden Age. It was a helpful age for Catholicism, too, because in reaction to the Protestant Reformation, the Catholics had the Counter-Reformation, which really did help the Catholic Church, and a lot of, art and music, like Baroque art and music from the Baroque period really comes from the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation, and there's also a lot of great Protestant Baroque music as well, Bach and Handel, they're Protestant. So the era of Protestant scholasticism was just a Protestant version of medieval scholasticism, and tons of important developments in art, math, and science came from Protestant countries during that time period. That's also around when America was founded. America was founded towards the end of that, a little bit more towards the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was when the seeds of the fall of that Third Golden Age were planted. Because the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening began to change the church a bit, and there was a bit of a distrust for traditional religion. But things were still going pretty strong until, like, the 20th century, and that's when the Third Christian Golden Age really started to die out. And we are still living off the fumes of the Third Christian Golden Age. Like, people think, like, oh, the church is in a terrible spot today, but I think right now we're in a much more Christian age than we are going to be in 20, 30, 50 years. I think it still hasn't fully died yet. It's still in the process of dying. It needs to finish dying out before the phoenix can rise from the ashes, so to speak. So this whole quick history crash course biased lesson from me was really just my way of saying you can see from church history that things go in cycles. And that's the way it looks to me. And there are a lot of postmillennials today who are, I think, unwisely optimistic about the near future of the church. People, like Doug Wilson or in the CREC, I think they want to plant churches everywhere because they're super optimistic about how the church is going to be in our lifetimes. I am not optimistic about that. Now, I do think there is one way we can sort of make the next dark age either be mitigated or be delayed, or maybe plant the seeds of a fourth golden age, and that's by retaking the mainline Protestant churches. But that's going to be really hard to do, and I am trying to do that. That's why I have the whole Operation Reconquista. I'm part of an organized effort to revive the mainline Protestant churches. But I really think the big thing that killed the Third Golden Age of the Church, the big thing that killed the Protestant Golden Age, was the fall of the mainline Protestant churches. And even if you're not part of the Reconquista, even if you think the mainline churches have gotten so corrupted and hijacked that we just have to leave them behind and start over again, kind of like I just did with St. Athanasius Presbyterian Church in Minecraft, even if you believe that, even if you think it's over, I want people to recognize the severity of the situation. I don't know why I'm quoting this movie. I saw this movie with my fiance recently. In Inside Out, all these emotions are personified. And there's this one, like, weird elephant character who's really sad, and the character of the joy emotion keeps telling the elephant, don't be sad, everything's great, come on, we gotta do this. And it doesn't help the elephant. The elephant keeps being sad. But then the sadness emotion consoles the elephant and is like, I know how you feel. So the point of that is, when there's, like, a really big tragedy, it doesn't help to slap a smiley face on that. What helps is to recognize the severity of the tragedy. And the collapse of Protestant Christendom, the loss of the mainline Protestant churches, really is a tragedy. So even if people don't want to be like me and try and retake the mainline Protestant churches, even if people don't want to stick in these liberal denominations like the PCUSA, which is what I'm doing, I want them to at least realize how tragic and devastating the fall of the mainline churches is. Because think about it. I read a lot of books that were written during, like, the late 1800s or early 1900s, back when the mainline Protestant churches were at their height. And it is like stepping into a portal to a fantasy world. Just imagine this for a second. Every single town in America had like 3 Bible-believing Presbyterian churches that also had huge, beautiful stone cathedral-like buildings. We're talking every town in America, not just big cities. We're talking like middle-of-nowhere rural Nebraska would have beautiful stone Presbyterian churches that also preached the Bible. And all of these churches had lots of families with lots of kids that were catechized with the Westminster Larger Catechism. And these churches were extremely involved in their communities. Like the mayors of most of these towns would go to these mainline churches, and the churches would be at the forefront of, community outreach. The churches would like build public libraries. They were respected by their entire communities. They would organize, picnics for everything. Their churches were also very involved in social activism. They would help widows and orphans. Everyone respected them, and because of how much respect the churches had from all the work they did in the town, it was easy for people to be Christian. It was easy for people to become Christian because of how respected the church was by the community. And if you just look at, records of how people acted and talked back then, there was a lot less degeneracy in society. Like, there's always been degeneracy because society's always been full of sinners. So I'm not, going to commit a golden age fallacy and say everything was perfect back then. But if you just, listen to how men talked to women back then, it was with so much more respect. That's why I don't take feminism seriously, because they want to respect women, but they promote, gangster rap music that really does treat women like sexual objects. Men were so respectful to women back then, and it was, safe for women to walk home at night in those towns. So yes, not everything was better back then. I am glad we live in the time we do with modern Western medicine, especially because of how much of a hypochondriac I am. I don't think I would last, 2 days in one of those old times. But I also think we can legitimately say it was a better time for the church back then. So, modern conservative offshoots like the PCA, they've done some things to try and rebuild. The PCA is a conservative offshoot because they split from the mainstream Presbyterian denomination due to it going too liberal. But they've just not been able to recreate what the main lines used to be. They do not have all the institutional development. They have, a good number of churches. Most of their churches don't have those historic buildings. Most of those churches are, not in the center of town like the Presbyterian churches used to be. They're off on some side road renting out some public school's cafeteria. They're not connected to the community. They're not recognized in the community. Community concerts don't happen there. And there still are, mainline Presbyterian churches that are beautiful and in the center of communities, but most of the time they're not really preaching the gospel. So you have to choose between churches that are on the margins of society and preach the gospel, or churches that are, beautiful and have a central place in the town, and architecture and the stuff really does matter, but they're not really preaching the gospel. But back in the day, back during the third golden age of the church, the Protestant golden age, you had both. You didn't have to choose between one or the other. So all this is to say, I understand if people really don't see any hope for the mainline Protestant denominations and they feel like the only place that they can survive is in these conservative offshoots such as the PCA. I get it. I do think the retreat to begin with was cowardly, but now that it's happened, it's going to be kind of hard to undo it, even though I think we should eventually try to undo it. I get it. But what I don't want people to do is slap a smiley face on it and sort of say, it's all right, souls are still being saved, so we're still good. Yes, individual souls will always still be saved. God always preserves a remnant, even in the darkest of times for the church. But what happens to the culture and the institutional strength of the church really matters. Back in those days, because the church had so much institutional strength, there wasn't so much cultural pressure to not be Christian, and it wasn't super common to see, Christian families have their kids being indoctrinated by unchristian ideologies and leaving the faith. But nowadays, that's very common, even for parents who really try and shelter their kids in good conservative churches and homeschool their kids and do all the right things. Due to the cultural pressures, the kids often still end up leaving the faith and hating their parents because they've been brainwashed by progressive ideologies. You can't legitimately shelter kids from absolutely everything. Eventually, they're going to be exposed to the world because it's the world. Even Amish kids have started using cell phones, which is pretty depressing, even though I don't support the Amish mindset. I think we need to engage with the world. So, another reason I'm not a fan of postmillennialism, it connects to this, is I think that unconditional optimism ironically leads to retreatism. Because I always talk about, we can't retreat from the culture. The church needs to stay in the culture and transform the culture. And people are like, oh, I guess you must be postmillennial. Well, no, I'm actually amillennial. Because if you think that Christians are guaranteed cultural victory, why wouldn't you retreat now? That's the interactions I've had with a lot of postmillennials. People supporting, like, moving to rural Idaho and doing some weird church plant there instead of engaging with the culture now. They'll be like, oh, well, we are eventually promised cathedrals in 500 years once we win back the culture, so we're just getting a head start. So it's like, what that really means is, oh, I don't want to fight for the culture now. The culture's too dirty. I'm just going to move to a farm in the middle of nowhere and have 20 kids. Maybe my great-grandkids can fight for the culture. I think that's lazy. That's a lazy retreatist mindset. Because amillennials are not promised any cultural victory, we think that what we do here matters. Of course, God knows the future. God has written the future. But we don't know the future. The only future event we know about is that Jesus is going to come back. But until then, we have no idea what's going to happen. Maybe things will be great for the church, maybe they won't. So, in terms of our lifetimes, I think it's possible that in 500 years there might be another Christian golden age, probably in like Africa or Asia or something. But in our lifetimes, the only way we can stop this massive decline of Christianity is to retake the mainline Protestant churches. These evangelical offshoots aren't going to cut it. If you just read books from the time when the mainline Protestant churches were at their height and compare it to, modern conservative offshoots, it's not even worth comparing. It's nothing like what it used to be. It's kind of like how the Israelites realized their second temple was nothing like the glory of their first temple. It's not even worth comparing. So, the only way we can ever hope to see positive change for the church in our lifetimes is if we retake the mainline Protestant churches. That's literally the only way. Now, some people in my comments are going to be like, just become Catholic, bro, whatever. That's not helpful. I've made up my mind. If all I wanted was like a strong institutional church, I would have become Catholic a long time ago. Yes, I will say the Catholic Church is more institutionally strong in America than the Protestant churches these days, but, in Latin America, everyone's leaving the Catholic Church because of how corrupt it is and going like Pentecostal or whatever. And it's also just not helpful. I've made up my mind long ago that I'm not Catholic, so don't bother trying to convince me of that. I am Protestant. All right, I'm Protestant no matter what. I want Protestants to have large institutions and be, successful like we used to be. But right now, we're just not. So, postmillennialism, I think it is just a false optimism that's not very helpful right now. We need to take the red pill. The blue pill is saying that, oh yeah, my church plant is eventually going to buy back some mainline building and it's going to be just like the good old days. That's a blue pill. The red pill is realizing the Protestant church is in the worst state it's ever been since the Reformation. Every year, the historic Protestant institutions go more liberal, and the conservative Protestant offshoots get more contemporary and less historic. We are in the worst time for Protestantism that we've been since Protestantism began. That's the red pill. That's the hard pill that we all need to swallow. We've been alienated from the institutions, just the way I've been alienated from my Minecraft church. And I don't know what the future is going to look like, but it doesn't look good.